He's still on.
I got nothing else to say.
Yeah, I'm playing golf that moment. I don't know what you're doing.
All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and get started. Before we get into the theme of the day, wanted to pick up some stuff that we talked about a little bit about last week. And then there was one more piece of introductory material that I didn't really have time for. So remember we talked about how the Psalms were laid out on the page. So here is a Hebrew, it's just all crammed together, right? In this ancient text. And I don't know where it's from or how old it is, but that's what Hebrew looks like. And you can see the little dots below the letters. You might be able to see their little dots. Yeah. Some of those dots are the vowels, and then there are some, I don't know if I included a slide, that might be the indicators of how it was to be sung. But one of the things, and it's true for Greek as well, is that they were limited both by the amount of what they had to write on. It's not like they could go to the closet, pick up another ream of paper. So whether it was a piece of parchment or papyrus, they were limited. So they wanted to get as much on the page as they could, which is why it was also crammed together. And I think I do, yeah. So here's Psalm 100, the Jubilate, and you can see how it's spread out in sort of the prayer book version, and how it's crammed together in a Hebrew text. And yeah, on this one you can see if you, of course, Hebrew's read from right to left. So if you go past where it says Psalm 100, and you see six individual letters between the first and second letter, and under the third letter, there are marks. Those are not vowels, because that's not where the vowels belong. So those may have been indicators to the person who is singing it, how to sing or chant the psalm. So, but nobody really knows how they mean it. And the Ashkenazi Jews sing it differently than the Sephardic Jews and things like that. So we just don't know. We don't know. But I thought I'd show you what that kind of looked like. And I couldn't find a really ancient version of the Hebrew, but in some of the early papyri of Greek texts, there are no spaces. You don't even know where one verse stops and another one. You have to be able to read through, and if you see a conjunction or something like that, then you know you're starting a new sentence. And so the work of translation from those early texts is real challenging for the translator, because you've got to know the word. I'll just give you an example. There's a word in Greek, and it translates or transliterates to de, dead. That's always the second word in a sentence. Always. And so you know that if you hit dead, that the word before that begins the sentence. So we don't have those same kinds of things in English. We just ran everything together in VMS. So anyway, I thought I'd show that to you. So the other thing that we didn't really talk about is how I talked about how the Psalter came to be and how it was set up in these 5 books and all of that kind of stuff, and what kinds of the internal groupings, like for the Korahites or for Asaph, or all of those they don't mean anything to us. Well, in the early part of the 20th century, this guy, Hermann Gunkel, he was part of sort of the new what at the time was the new way of doing biblical scholarship. Let's read it in its context. Let's read them. Let's read passages and understand that a proverb is different than a law, is different than a story, and that these forms have their own way of carrying meaning. Well, Gunkel did this with the Psalms, and what he wanted to do is Sitz im Leben. Well, how were they situated in life? So we have all of these Psalms that are Psalms of David, but how are they situated in life? Because they aren't all looking like each other. And in these various 5 books in the Psalms, there are similarities between things that are in the first book and in the last book. So what do those similarities look like? And Gunkel was the first to do this and provided kind of the basis for how we're going to go through these next several weeks. So he came up with these 5 categories. There are hymns, which is a really big category. And he divided things up into communal laments, individual laments. Psalm 13 was an individual lament. But there are communal events, the laments, and Bishop Epting will talk about these laments that were the whole nation was lamenting, as opposed to individuals. Individual thanksgivings, and then royal psalms. And so he developed this in 1926 again, and I just thought that's where we got our breakdown. Now, scholars since then have broken them down in different ways, or broke them down. They don't have individual laments, they just have laments, communal and individual, which is how we're doing it. Thanksgivings, individual and communal. And then they've added some others. So for our purposes, we've got royal psalms, psalms of lament, psalms of wisdom, psalms of Zion, which are different than royal psalms. So these are psalms about Jerusalem and about the center of everything. Psalms of thanksgiving, both individual and communal, and then psalms of trust. So that's how the 3 of us broke this down, given Gunkel's leading and saying that there are really categories that you can pick out of. And some of these categories have a lot of them, and some of them have very few. And so some of them we had to do more choosing in some cases than in others. So what we're doing here today is, you can't see it, it's red, royal psalms. God is both God as king, and then Israel and Judah's king. So the individual mortal kings. So royal psalms. What were royal psalms? And so if you look over on the right, the little map, this is a map of what Jerusalem would have looked like during Solomon's time, when the first temple was built, not the second temple, not the one that was built after they came back from exile. And you can see that the temple and the royal palace were basically just cheek by jowl. They're like sharing a wall. And so, in some respects, the temple was the chapel of the palace. That there was this association, this close association between God and the monarch. And the king was the adopted son of God, sort of vice-regent, wasn't descended from God like in the other religions, but adopted, and had the job of maintaining covenant law and then defending Israel against the enemies. What's the job of a king, right? And I was thinking, as I was putting this together, I was thinking, in order to form a more perfect union, all of the things, what we to provide for the common defense, all of those sorts of things, in this case, it was to maintain covenant law, defend Israel against enemies. If there was a new king, often, even if the old king died, they would wait until the new year to crown or anoint or enthrone the new king. So the connection of the New Year's festival and the enthronement festivals were often the same, or closely aligned. And as we talked about last week, psalms might be written just like we might have the poet laureate at the inauguration. So those are royal psalms. What do we see? We see some assurances of justice. That's part of the king's job. Prayers that God will listen to the king's voice, praising God for what God's done, prayers of trust, and then give good news to the king. Those are all sort of basic categories of these royal psalms. And this little statue, this little head, was found only about 7 or 8 years ago, on the border, kind of on the border between Israel and current-day Israel and Syria. But they've been able to date it back to the 9th century. They weren't sure what king it was, but it was in a place where in the northern kingdom there would have been royal presence. And they know it's a king because it doesn't show up very well. The thing around his head is clearly a crown, it's gold, if you've got better pictures. So in today's Psalms, there are, like I said, this is one of those categories where there weren't as many possibilities as in some of the others. But we have 2 where God is the king, and 4 where Israel or Judah's king, where it's the mortal king, enthroned in coronation and reigning. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to, I can talk a little bit more about each psalm, but I want to hear what you looked at and what you found, kind of going back to Jim led the poetry classes, not me talking, it's you all talking about what did you find in these psalms that was helpful or problematic or whatever. And there are prayer books and Bibles. And you might find a prayer book underneath your chair, some of them, or a Bible. Some of these have prayer books or Bibles down there or not. So I want to hear what you all have to say, and let's enter into some conversation about it.
Can you read the numbers for those of us who are blind?
You can't see it, so
I can't.
the two Psalms of God as King are Psalms 94 and 96. I'll make it bigger next time.
Maybe it's just me.
No, it is not. And I had a question, you can look at either one of them, but if we end up talking about Psalm 94, why do you think that this is categorized as a royal psalm? Keeps thought out there.
Well, certainly they're asking for protection. Somebody to, like the battle, God of vengeance, show yourself.
I guess in the first part of that psalm, the verse that struck me was in the prayer book numbering, it's number 6. I know that oftentimes the verses are broken out differently, but they murdered the widow and the stranger and put the orphans to death. Those were the 3 categories of people that the law particularly protected. They were the favored ones. They were to have special consideration, and the bad guys, a whooping.
They were the favored because they were the most vulnerable.
Right.
Please do speak up, not just for the microphone, but for other people who might be occluded by somebody sitting in front of them. So.
I have to say that I felt, reading the first line, it was sort of vengeance. If I'm going to pray, I won't have the word vengeance in my prayer. And so I sort of felt shocked in a way because it didn't feel prayerful, but it's in a different culture, in a different time, in a different setting of violence and non-violence and how people live their lives in that time. So I had to come to understand that before I continued.
Yeah, one of the categories that somebody else used, we're not using, were psalms of malediction, where you're invoking God to do something to these other people. You know, and this certainly has that at the beginning, you know, it's,
There's
it's,
such a,
you gotta show yourself.
such
even
a
says-
long list of adversaries in there, descriptions of bad behavior.
It even says in verse 2, give them what they deserve.
Yes, yeah,
It's coming from a lived experience of something. It's,
yeah. Scholars have noted that the first part of this song really is a lament. It is a lament. It is what we heard, a little bit what we heard this morning. This shouldn't be happening. Do something about it, doggone it.
I wonder if the feeling and position of how people pray to God has changed over time. Because, you know, going back in our lifetime, two things were black and white. You know, you do this and you're done. Don't do that and whatever. And so now, coming back, looking at this time and then going now, where we are more gentle in our prayers, where we don't cry out for vengeance when we're praying, or as some people might, but I feel that a lot of people don't. And so I think it's the culture and how we perceive God as the centuries have gone by. I don't know, I might be wrong, but I feel that.
What do people think?
I was, my Sicilian grandmother always thought conversation was God, that God was okay. So when I read a lot of this, I hear her talking, raised in the Depression, 9 kids, no money and no food. And so they would work the farm, they had a 40-acre farm, but then they had to go work other farms just to make enough money. So they would work from sunrise to sunset. And at noon, they'd go to the other farm. Well, in Michigan, with 35 inches of rain, it rained often. And my grandmother could see a storm coming, and she would just tell God, you have to wait until we get my job done. And it has to be done now, and you have to understand, I have to work this afternoon in another place. And her sons were always angry with her because if it rained, you couldn't work. So you could just kind of hang out, lay around. And Frank would always say to Joe, it's not fair. Mom talks to God. So she has this, so when I read this, I see my grandmother talking to God saying, get this fixed, or why is it this way? Why do you do this to me? You know, I follow the law and I'm good, and yet this happens. Why is that? And usually the storm just kind of goes left or right of the farm until noon, and they go to work, and then it rains in the afternoon.
And for the Jews, you know, their faith is such a part of everyday life and everyday existence. I mean, even to the meals, ceremonial meal, and the welcome in the Sabbath, and it's sort of logical that they would want to engage God on the everyday. I mean, whatever it is they're facing. How long, oh Lord? We have a tendency sometimes to have God so far away that God couldn't possibly be concerned about whether it's going to rain or not, or God couldn't possibly be concerned about my little problems when there's all these great problems in the world. I think the Hebrew theology really deals with it that way. It's God is on the throne, all right, but God is also immanent in the midst of life, everyday life.
Irma?
Well, I liked 13 a lot, and it reminded me of Job, which was referenced in the sermon this morning. My father lost his wife in 1938. He had a 4-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. And he worked for the REA Express, which was a railroad, part of the railroads. And he was not a devout Republican. He switched whenever he thought it was the right candidate. And his deathbed confession to me was he voted for Harry Truman in 48, and that was his only deathbed confession. And he read Job, and it was his favorite book of the Bible. And when I finally got all the way through Job, I really understood it. And one day my family was in terrible mess. I was driving every day from Greeley, Colorado to Heritage High School in Littleton. And all the way down, I talked to God with tears of anger. I understand this song real well. Is my Job period over with yet? Can I find peace? And it was somewhat cathartic by the time I got to Heritage, I was able to teach. So I think it's good for us to vent with God, to tell God how we feel. And it doesn't mean we love him less, and it doesn't mean that we aren't faithful. It's just when things happen, and we don't think they should happen, we gotta have an opportunity to vent. I think and that's what's happening in Christendom.
I kind of like the contrast between 94 and 96.
Okay.
That, 94, it really is aggrieved, and it's talking to God. 96 seems to be talking to people. And no matter what happened in 94, in 96, this is what you should do, and you should be glad, and you should rejoice, and you should do it out loud, and it's a much more positive.
Yeah, so 96 is a sort of a classic enthronement song, the Enthronement Festival. This is, we're moving into a new era here. Sing the Lord a new song. There's new stuff. So whether it's the new year and in non-Jewish cultures, you put the God back up on the throne, to start the new year, or whether it's just a standard New Year re-celebration of the accession of the King. Every anniversary you celebrate. But this is really, you're right. This is a celebration. This is not that kind of lament. Or there's even wisdom. There's wisdom stuff in Psalm 94. That whole chunk about you ignorant people learn quickly. This sounds very much like a wisdom psalm. So there's some of that in there. But in Psalm 94, you've got all of this sort of mushed together, and there's a little bit of effort required on the part of the interpreter to say, is this a royal psalm? I mean, you can make the reach, but it's surrounded by other psalms that really are royal psalms. And so they thought, and many of the commentators who think it is, thought, well, because it's in there, it must be a royal psalm, because it's surrounded by other royal psalms. And so they would say that in 94, the speaker, whether it's the king, or is it, he's doing this stuff for himself, but he's also speaking on behalf of the people. So even though it sounds communal and it sounds individual, the king is doing this speaking. Psalm 96 is different altogether. You're right in that regard. And it is about God, not about a human, a mortal king. Declare God's glory. The Lord is great, so worthy of praise, awesome beyond all other gods. And then give to the Lord power. Bring God gifts. Tell the nations God rules. This is all about some kind of festival where the divine is the focus, not a king.
It's fun to read these Psalms in light of Israel's history, where initially God was the king, but then Israel said, no, we want to be like the other countries. We want to have a real physical king we can look at and complain to and all that stuff. And so reluctantly, God allows Israel to have a dynasty. But there's that interplay always. Who's really in charge here? Is it a physical king, or is it, or is it God? And the sort of merging that you referred to earlier of the divine intent, the funneling of that into a human being tries to bridge that gap. But there is tension there. Which is very human.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel warns them about,
What's that?
Samuel warns them about it.
Yeah.
Okay, you want a king, you can have one, but he's gonna take your sons to war, he's gonna do this.
Tax
that, and the
you.
other. Yeah, do you want this kind of thing? Oh, yeah, we gotta be like the other nations.
Yeah.
Be careful what you pray for.
Yeah, it's very- But the other thing, you're bringing this up reminds me of, remember last week, and I don't know if this psalm has ever been identified in this context, but it could be, given what you were saying. Last week, we talked about sometimes the psalms, if there was an annual celebration of all of the tribes coming together to recommit themselves to their confederation, to have something like this be part of that, so you can confederate, but let's remember who's really king here, that would be a good place for this, but yeah, that's a.
That's a great point, because I read the Psalms from a Jewish translation, this, which is what I prefer, and this psalm definitely speaks to the nations and the bringing together of the nations, and that's how I'm getting what I'm reading in this translation, so thank you for saying that. It makes sense. It makes sense in this context.
Other thought, yeah, Irma?
Now, I have thought a lot about how these psalms fit today. In the United States of America, we made the decision we didn't want a king, and we got a president. Our first one would only do 2 terms. He wasn't going to do any more than that. And so he established a principle of presidents having possibly 2 terms, but not more than that, till FDR at least. But there's a thing here that speaks to, as when the Jews asked for a king, there needs to be an evolution away from that power. And Saul's a good example of that, because the power went to his head. And then, David came, and David did a lot of stuff he shouldn't have done. And he always asked forgiveness, but he did a lot of stuff he shouldn't have done. And the idea is, at least in the United States of America, we can kick him out.
Well, to your point, Irma, I think, in Israel, you've got God,
Yeah.
and then God's regent, who rules in God's stead.
Yeah.
The United States being set up as a secular nation, put the people as God, and theoretically, the president would serve on behalf of the people in the people's stead, theoretically.
Yes.
So, there is that sort of parallelism. I hadn't thought about it in that way until you brought that up. That's interesting. Other thoughts on these, or we turn for a little while to maybe some of the ones about the king themselves.
Probably goes without saying, but just make sure we note it, when it's capitalized Lord, is all in capitals. That just means we're supposed to say it louder. It means that Yahweh was being referred to, the Hebrew name of God, which is from Moses was given at the burning bush, and sort of means I am that I am, or I will be who I will be, or
You can't put me in a box.
It's a very powerful word, not to be pronounced out loud, but rather substituted by Adonai. So when they would read this song, they wouldn't say Yahweh, they would say Adonai.
The translation, the Jerusalem Bible translation, which the English version, which was a translation of a French translation, but there's even the New Jerusalem, which is a little bit better, always when Yahweh is in there, writes that out. So you can be clear that when we're so accustomed to using Lord for both human Lord and God, that it's not always clear, but they make it clear in that translation. The word Baal, is just Ugaritic for Lord. So, but they left that one that way. So these are the games translators play. Let's move into these other psalms, and for folks who can't read them, it's 2, 72, 101, and 45. 2, 72, and 101 are all sort of coronation and throne room psalms. 45 is of an entirely different category altogether. And I don't know if I forgot to bring the list. I have a list of all of the psalms that we have in the Sunday lectionary. Some of them we use over and over and over again. Some of them we only use once, like Psalm 13. And I don't know if Psalm 45 shows up in the Sunday lectionary. I wouldn't think that it does, but Anyway, so you all, where do you all want to go?
I can't stand silence. So I will,
Go ahead, take it.
I will start with Psalm 72, which I think presents an extraordinary vision of leadership, national leadership. The role of the king or the ruler, or one might say the executive branch, is to defend the needy among the people, rescue the poor, crush the oppressor. He will come down like rain on the mown field, like showers that water. He brings grace. And again, further on in the psalm, he will deliver the poor, cries out in distress. He will have pity on the lowly. He shall redeem their lives. In my innocent and naive youth, I wrote a letter to Bill Clinton, and when he was negotiating, I think it was a budget negotiation, and he traded away some of the social, what's the word I'm looking for, some of the social programs.
Service network.
Yeah, right. And I was concerned about that, and I wanted to remind him what true leadership was, so I sent him this song. I never got a reply. I only assumed he was more concerned with Monica Lewinsky than he was with Psalm 72. But I just think when we contemplate the sort of leadership we want nationally, this psalm lays out a model which is hard to ignore. Pretty powerful stuff, I think.
Yeah, again, commentators would say, they've seen this as appropriate for a coronation or the annual celebration, sort of a reminder, of what I was called to do.
And my Bible titles it as the reign of a righteous king.
Yeah. And the juxtaposition of that, those qualities with royalty and monarchy and all the rest. I thought about that with the coronation of the English king. It's all this pomp and circumstance, and then he reads this psalm or this prayer about self-offering and being there for the people and all the rest. It's kind of hard to square that circle, but then it is with us too. I mean, the coronation of the president is sort of almost like the coronation of the king. All this power and everything is lauded upon the executive, and yet this is the kind of reminder that any leader needs. Right.
Yeah, and it reminds me, your point reminds me that annually, it used to always be on Maundy Thursday, but it gets moved around for diocesan convenience now. Clergy would go before the bishop to renew their ordination vows. So there's this reminder of this is what we're supposed to be at. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And I don't know of any country or any that does that. An annual, we inaugurate the president and then forget about it until we inaugurate the next one.
Right.
We crowned Charles, but I don't think there's an annual celebration on the accession. So you can forget pretty quickly. Say, well, that was then. This is now.
And imagine David, struggling with his own issues as he did, having to do this every year and being reminded of this is what you're really supposed to be about. Not sending people off into battle to die because they're married to your lover.
Right.
That's nothing.
And we actually do that with renewal of baptismal vows. So we do that 5 or 6 times a year, or 7 times a year, depending. So to remind us of who we are. But yeah, this is a great sort of psalm for that purpose. We're kind of running short on time. Turn to Psalm 45, just because it's so much fun. And as you're getting there and starting to read it, note the title, For the Music Leader, according to the Lilies of the Korahites, a masculine love song. So, this has all sorts of things that we have no idea what they mean. We don't know what according to the Lilies means. It probably was a tune, maybe, an arrangement of a tune. We don't know. Of the Korahites, were they a particular group of singers? We don't know. Nobody knows what a maskil is. The Jewish scholars, contemporary Jewish scholars, still haven't a clue what a maskil is. I think we all know what a love song is. But, here the person who is speaking is, kind of like the court singer. This isn't either one of the other two people in this that are represented here. This is the court singer. Oh, a marvelous word has stirred my heart as I mentioned my works to the king. My tongue is the pen of a skilled scribe. It's just this really, and there are a lot of psalms that show this. There's some real flamboyant, sort of oriental court language sort of in here, Oh, you're the most handsome of men. Grace is poured out on your lips, Strap on your sword, great warrior, with your glory. And then, listen, daughter, pay attention. Down in verse 10, forget your people and your father's house. So, it's a love song. Most everybody thinks that it was written for a royal wedding. The reference, where is it? In verse 12, the city of Tyre, the wealthiest of all, will seek your favor with gifts. Some speculate that this was written for, who was it that married Jezebel? Ahab, who married Jezebel, who was a princess of Tyre. Of course, she fell to a bad end, but that doesn't stop them from thinking good things about it when it started, but she was not well, she didn't end well. We'll leave it at that. But we don't know, and others have thought it was just a popular wedding song. And some have said, no, it was really written for a royal wedding, but like lots of things that get written for royal weddings, all brides after that have to have that too. So I remember doing a wedding in San Francisco, and the bride was Australian, and the groom was American. And, this was I don't want to go too far into it, because it was interesting in lots of ways. But she wanted the wedding to look like Princess Dies.
Oh, dear.
And we were doing this in the Presidio, the chapel in the Presidio in San Francisco. So the room was nothing like, Princess Dies, but she wanted all of that. So, weddings happen, and people want to emulate that stuff. And so that was part of the thing, thinking about this, that this royal wedding song became a wedding song for subsequent marriages. But it's cloth of gold dressed in pearls and all of that. It's pretty flamboyant.
I would imagine that verse 12 in the Prayer Book translation, it's probably 11 in others, could be troublesome for women today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bow down to him. That line.
I'm sorry?
The line that he's your master.
Yeah.
Yeah. Different translations. All your clothes have the pleasing scent of myrrh, almonds, and cinnamon.
There was a Persian wedding. The expense was $20 million.
$20 million for a Persian wedding.
A Persian wedding. What kind of wedding was that?
Expensive. Anybody want to look at any of the other songs? we covered kind of 4 of them, which is about as much as we did with any of the poems. I think my biggest question about any of these sort of going forward, although we've talked about how, yes, maybe the president should be reminded of Psalm 72 every so often, but how do these become individualized? How do we read these as individuals? I'm not expecting anybody to have an answer, you might, but that was, as I was considering these royal psalms and how we were going to talk about them this morning, it's easy to kind of do a lament or a thanksgiving or a song of praise or thanks, those kinds of things. But how do we translate a royal song into anything that is part of our own realities? I don't have an answer, so I hope you do.
Yeah, but I think that idea of the president, does give some analogy of how we might look at it. And he's not a king, but clearly the president has all kinds of power and authority in this.
I think just knowing that, having a context for them, because as kind of a rookie reader of the Psalms, I think, oh, they're short, they must be accessible, and that has not been the case for me many times. But at least knowing that, okay, so this was for a wedding celebration, or this was a that. Maybe it doesn't have much to do with my day-to-day, but at least it has a context. So that's a start. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's good old Gunkel. Sits in Laban is context. That's it. And until the mid to late 19th century and into the 20th century, scholars, readers weren't really paying a heck of a lot of attention to context and things like that. And that was part of the gift, unexpected gift that Darwin gave us, is that things kind of evolved. There are other reasons for why things are and all of that sort of stuff. And that began to be applied to textual criticism, not just biblical, but in other kinds of texts and things like that. So, the context is that's what Gunkel gave us.
And I think also for me personally, taking away some of the doctrine, the church doctrine, sort of stripping them and letting the plaintive voice come through.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I choose certain translations, because I have found that a Jewish translation has more of that plaintive voice, that individualized voice, even though it may be Israel speaking, but that to me I can relate to much better than having it packed with centuries of church baggage.
There's a line that's often used on saints' days in the prayer book, which is, their sound has gone forth into all the world, and it's often used for apostles. Well, the psalm has nothing to do with that. It's about nature, the sun rising and going, rising and setting. That sound of nature has gone forth into all the world. So it always irritates me when they apply it to an apostle, because there's not anything to do with that.
Now, I think, when we were talking about this, 3 of us were talking about this, I'll just ask this question, and when we read Psalm 13 this morning, did you think about it in the ways that I hope that I kind of, or was it, well, we've got the psalm and we're going to read it responsibly by, and so we got, you missed the asterisk, or were we also caught up in this sort of liturgical reading that the power of the psalm is sort of lessened. And I think that is one of the downfalls of, we've got to read the Psalms, but even in the daily office, when you're reading it maybe by yourself or a smaller group, it can be lost, because you're still doing it sort of perfunctorily, because you read the psalm and then you're going to get to the lesson, and I want to get done in 12 minutes, and so but they're there, and if we lose a lot of that when we structure it when we put it in this kind of structure.
Psalm is more than a filler between the Old Testament and the Epistle.
Yeah.
The way I see it is, it sort of makes me think like today, you were reading that, we were talking about. It's like being given an invitation, like somebody's got a GoPro camera and they're taking you into the perspective of the person that did this song.
Yeah.
So you actually, for the same reason we watch things like James Bond and superheroes and stuff like that. It invites us to become from their perspective. And I see these songs as saying, okay, we are sort of go into that way of being able to see from their perspective. Last week I was talking to Celeste about, talking about Australia, but I have a Nordic Track treadmill. But within that, there's a program called iFit, and it enables you to have these videos of a point of view trek to all these places, including Australia. And it sort of transports you into that perspective out of the everyday world, so you get to experience it as they did. So when we see all this royal stuff and all that, I'm saying I have actually been invited to see from that perspective. And it gives me fulfillment outside of the mundane, just get it over with. It's transcendent, I guess.
All aspire to have clothes that smell of myrrh, cassia, and aloes. All right, well, the next week, it's laments, and both communal and individual.
Yeah, it would be cheery, yeah.
Yeah,
Lord, tear them down.
there are not a lot of psalms of comedy. Anyway, the list of those psalms was on the syllabus. It will also, so you can download that and go back. And maybe what I'll ask Kathy to do is put the psalms in the email as well, just the psalms, those numbers.
So I'm gonna have prayer books on your chair, and we'll read them, and we're even gonna sing one.
All right. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, people too, if you want to take one of these books, feel free, and just bring them back when you can. Put them on the cart in the library.
Library.
It started.